Welcome to World War II Indiana Landmarks, Episode 23, the Freeman Army Airfield and Museum. I'm your host, Ron May, author of the book, World War II Indiana Landmarks. For today's episode, we travel south of Indianapolis, down Interstate 65, to the southern part of Indiana and the city of Seymour. On December 1st, 1942, almost a year after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, a new military airfield took shape near the south-central Indiana town of Seymour, which rests just west of Interstate 65, halfway between Indianapolis and Louisville, and due west of Cincinnati. Some 27 farms on 2,600 acres were swallowed up by the project, which transformed the once tranquil agricultural setting into a little city with a beehive of military activity. Construction of the airfield had begun in May 1942 and was completed 9 months later in February 1943 at a cost of over $1 million. The official dedication of the airfield was held on April 29, 1943. The completed airfield consisted of 4 paved runways, over 400 buildings, and 12 miles of road. Freeman Army Airfield was built to train Army Air Forces pilots to fly multi-engine planes. Having already completed their pre-flight, primary, and basic schools, the pilots who reported to Freeman Field were introduced to twin-engine planes in preparation for flying bombers or transport planes in combat theaters. The pilot trainees at Freeman flew one of 250 Beech AT-10 Wichita aircraft throughout the 9-week course. The AT-10s were twin-engine training planes comprised mostly of wood. Following their graduation, the pilots proceeded to their final phase of training at a different base to learn to fly the specific bomber or transport plane to which they were assigned. Among the 400 buildings on the base, 5 of them housed Link trainers, 12 in each building. The Link trainers, developed by Edward Link in 1929, were the first generation of flight simulators that taught cadets how to fly by instrument reading and radio navigation. The simulator instructors, often women, monitored the simulation with equipment on a nearby desk connected to the simulator sensors by cables. The student's flight path was accurately traced by an automatic recorder. More than 500,000 U.S. aviation cadets were trained on such simulators during World War II and the Korean conflict. The first class of 121 pilots graduated from the new airfield on April 29, 1943. This was also the occasion for the renaming of the airfield. Initially called the Army Air Base Seymour, the name was changed to Freeman Army Airfield to honor Captain Richard Freeman of Winnemac, Indiana. Freeman was a West Point graduate who was killed in 1941 when his plane, an experimental version of the B-17 bomber, crashed in Nevada during a training exercise and killed all 8 crewmen. A total of 19 classes, consisting of 4,245 pilots, graduated from the twin-engine training at Freeman Army Airfield from April 1943 until February 1945. Tragically, 23 of the cadet pilots lost their lives during their training. At the peak of military operations, there were over 5,000 men and women stationed at Freeman Army Airfield, including Women Air Force Service pilots, WASPs, who ferried planes to the base and tested malfunctioning planes after their engines were rebuilt. Most of the pilots who graduated from Freeman Army Airfield were assigned to the 8th Air Force in England for duty in the European theater of war. The only Seymour area native to receive his training at Freeman Airfield was Lieutenant William Kenneth "Ken" McCain. Born in 1916, he joined the Army Air Corps in January 1941 and served in Panama at an air depot. While returning to the U.S. to begin pilot training in 1942, his ship was torpedoed by a German submarine. He and several other survivors were rescued from their lifeboat 12 hours later by a Navy vessel in the area. After completing his primary pilot training, McCain reported to Freeman Field for his twin-engine training and graduated with Class 43-I on October 1st, 1943. McCain served as a co-pilot and later as the first pilot of a B-24 in the 459th Bomb Group, 15th Air Force, stationed in Italy. Their bomber was named the Satan Shuttle Bus and sported on the plane nose a painted caricature of Hitler with an arrow piercing his heart. McCain flew 50 missions in southern Europe, bombing enemy targets in Munich, Vienna, France, Romania, Yugoslavia, and cities in North Italy. He was one of only 2 original pilots of the 459th Group who were alive when the war ended, the others having been killed or taken as POWs. After returning to the United States in September 1944, McCain became a flight instructor at Victorville Army Airfield in Victorville, California. On May 4th, 1945, 4 days before Germany surrendered, McCain died in an accident while flying a B-29 Superfortress in a night training exercise over California. Just 1 month earlier, in April 1945, an incident occurred back at Freeman Field that attracted national attention. It became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny. That spring, 2 squadrons of the newly formed 477th Bombardment Group arrived at Freeman Field to continue training on B-25J bombers. Both squadrons were made up of African American men who had been selected for the Tuskegee experiment, the training of black pilots and crew for service in the Army Air Forces. Shortly after arriving on base, a small group of the black flight officers went into the all-white Officers Club, which had been made off limits to them. When a group of black officers tried to return to the club the next day, they were barred from entering and arrested by the Provost Marshal. The interim commanding officer of the base, Colonel Selway, drew up a written agreement pledging acceptance of the segregation requirements. He insisted that all the 101 black men of the 2 squadrons sign the agreement. After refusing to sign it, all 101 black officers of the 2 squadrons were arrested, confined to their barracks, and scheduled for a court-martial. The men were transported to Godman Field in Kentucky and placed in the stockades while awaiting the general court-martial. They were later released by order of Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall. The Freeman Field Mutiny resulted in some bad press for the Army Air Forces. The peaceful protest of the Tuskegee Airmen was one of the contributing factors that motivated President Harry Truman to issue an executive order in 1948, officially ending segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. After the war in Europe concluded, Freeman Field was designated a Foreign Aircraft Evaluation Center in June 1945. During the next 14 months, 160 enemy German, Japanese, and Italian aircraft were shipped to the airfield for analysis. German aircraft mechanic prisoners of war interned at nearby Camp Atterbury were shuttled to the airfield to help assemble the German planes. In 1947, following the closing of the airfield, the government gave the property to the city of Seymour with the understanding that they would always use it for an airport. Today, the Freeman Municipal Airport in Seymour occupies part of the former airfield. Approximately 1,500 other acres are rented to local farmers. And the remainder of the former government property includes an industrial park with 60 businesses. Today, the Freeman Army Airfield Museum occupies two of the original base buildings within the industrial park. Started in 1996 by some dedicated area residents, the museum preserves the history of the airfield and the cadets who trained there during World War II. Displays for the museum came largely from donations of former cadets who trained there or from families of the cadets. The museum is housed in two former 3,000 square feet Link Trainer buildings used during the war. The first building contains items related to the history of the base and information on the cadets and their training. It includes an AT-10 display room showing photos and actual pieces of the former aircraft that was used for training the cadets. Another display shows the pilot cold weather gear used by the cadets. A glass case with pilot survival equipment is also on display. A dedicated bomber room includes model displays of the various bombers the cadets would eventually fly, and some of the actual bomb shells used on the planes. There is also a wall display dedicated to the Tuskegee Airmen who were at Freeman Field in April 1945 and the incident that occurred. A memorial marker remembering the Tuskegee Airmen is on the grounds just outside the museum entrance. More recently, in October 2022, a new Tuskegee Airmen memorial was added across the street from the museum near the airport tarmac. This memorial consists of two bronze Tuskegee Airmen with a flagpole between them. One airman is dressed in his officer uniform, and the other is in his flight gear. Their patriotism to serve in the armed forces and their courage to resist segregation are both celebrated. A nearby historical marker summarizes the story of the Freeman Field Mutiny. The second building of the museum complex, referred to as the Museum Annex, houses larger items, including a restored World War II-era fire truck that served the base, and a Link Trainer model display. Especially fascinating are the aircraft engine and propellers from both Allied aircraft and parts from foreign planes that were examined following the war when Freeman Field became a foreign aircraft evaluation center. These include parts from a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the vertical fin and rudder of a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter. Freeman Army Airfield has a proud and diverse history of service during World War II. Visitors to the museum will be glad they stopped to review the legacy of Seymour's contribution to the war effort. Learn more about the history of the Freeman Army Airfield and its museum, as well as those who served there in my new book, World War II Indiana Landmarks, available for purchase on my website or wherever books are sold. And while on my website, check out my trilogy of Indiana World War II service stories. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.